Ruthless Compassion is a podcast about how you can turn your emotional shit into fertilizer for success and see your darkest moments as opportunities to transform into a powerful kindness warrior. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review wherever you listen. Welcome, Mimi Nicklin, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
It's a pleasure too, and it's really fun because you are in Malaysia and it's now Thursday morning at 10 o'clock and I'm in Toronto and it's Wednesday evening at 9 o'clock. So it's like we're on different planets almost, and you have palm trees out your window and we have snow flurries. So.
It couldn't be more different, right? Different day of the week, different temperature, different everything.
Different everything. Well, hopefully similar ethos, right?
Yeah.
So what I like to do always at the very beginning is get my guests to introduce themselves and sort of tell a little bit about who you are, what you do, that kind of thing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as you said, my name's Mimi. I'm British originally, but I've been in Asia and Africa region for my entire career. I spent a lot of my life in marketing. And in 2018, my life kind of took a change and a diverge when I accepted a job in Dubai, which is in the Middle East. And I took over a large conglomerate role as a CEO for that region. And when I got there, I found that the role was, let's politely say, very different from I was expecting. So Marcia, in that process, I was thrown very much from the corporate world, which I was very used to. I'd been in corporate advertising for a long time where, you have 20 people in finance and, people everywhere to do everything, to becoming an entrepreneur really overnight. Whilst it was a global holding company, it was a very small business in that part of the world. So overnight, I went from being in a very corporate world with many people all around me to becoming an entrepreneur in a very small business, all alone, in a region that I didn't know, and I had no network and I had no support system. And in that process, I went to meet a business coach and we went out for lunch. And at that lunch, I was asking her, what is going on in this country, in this business environment? And she asked me about my leadership style. And I was talking about intuition. And I said, I'm a very intuitive leader and I listen to people intuitively. And she said, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And at the time I was like, no, it's not empathy. Like, what's empathy got to do with it? It can't possibly be empathy, right? But I went away from that lunch and I started researching the world of empathy. And I discovered the empathy deficit, which perhaps you and some of your listeners have heard of, but is fundamentally the lack of empathy in our world. It was coined actually by Barack Obama in 2006, so well before he was president. And I discovered this deficit, which is seeing our empathy levels decline by around 48% over the last 3 decades, over 30 years, and started to really understand the repercussions of that, the gaps that are between us, the distance we're creating, the stereotypes and the judgment, the aggression, violence. You mention it, whether you're talking about kind of war and peace or leadership, right? Across that span of the business world and society beyond. And as I said, that really changed my life, because once I discovered that, I started to write. I never, ever planned to write a book. I was not that person that was like, I'll be an author one day. No, that was not me. But I started to write. I ended up with a best-selling book. I ended up with a podcast in 2020 where 85,000 people came to listen to talk about empathy. And by the end of 2020, not only had the world changed, but my life had really changed. And I had moved into this space of really working in how we can create more empathy for our world.
Wonderful. What's the name of your book, by the way?
It's called Softening the Edge.
Very nice. Well, we'll be sure to put it in the show notes.
Thank you.
And so, Mimi, here you are. You're in the corporate world, and then you start looking into empathy. So you must have done some research, some studying of the topic. What have you found in terms of, possible reasons why people have less empathy these days?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's very multifaceted. I would say on the whole, some of the social trends we're seeing around us have really impacted that. So single person households is a big impact on that. So in some of our major cities, I don't know if Toronto is one of them, but some of the major cities around the world, we have up to 50% of households with a single person in them. So we're very isolated. We're living alone, and as human beings, we're not meant to be alone, right? We are pro-social species. And I often talk about the fact that, you know, generations gone by, we grew up in our villages, whatever that village was. We were born there, we went to school there, we probably got married there, we worked there, we lived within that community. And today, of course, with urbanization and globalization and the movement of people, we find many people from the top of society to the bottom alone and separated out from that community. So we see very low levels of belonging. I think technology has a role, not always a negative one. So people always ask me, like, is social media killing our empathy? And I always say, no, you know, it can, but it's not, because it has a dual role. It both disconnects but reconnects us. So, but technology plays a role. So there's many reasons when you look at urbanization and socialization and the movement of people, and you also look at the world that we're living in. I believe really, Marsha, that we are all living in fear all of the time. Now, we're not conscious of that. You know, a lot of that is subconscious. You know, you and I were touching on this offline earlier, you know, that whenever you put the news on or you turn on Instagram or any social platform that you're on, you are bombarded with sad or negative or scary or violent news, right? Or corrupt news. And I think one of the things that 2020 did was it reminded us, or perhaps told us, that we have no power, really, no real control, right? You know, suddenly, having sort of spent the last 30, 40, 50 years thinking we were on top of the world, our governments told us to stay home and we had no choice. So we took away control from people on a mass scale for the first time ever, really, or the first time in living memory, let's say. And people now, I think that lack of control just grows all the time. You know, wherever you sit politically or on the side of a war or on the side of rights, wherever you sit, you have pretty much no control to change anything that's going on out there. And what that does is it makes people introverted. It makes people go inwards to what they can control, right? Their own family, their small networks, what they know, their comfort zone. And of course, if we don't connect with other people, then that empathy decreases further because we become smaller and smaller in our world. So it's quite multifaceted. The good news is we can turn it around, but it's definitely not a pretty picture out there at the moment.
It's interesting, you know, last week they had on our national radio station, which is CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, they had a series called the Massey Lectures, which is a series of lectures that they do every year. And this year's speaker was a woman named Astra Taylor, and she's a documentary filmmaker and an activist. Her theme was the age of insecurity, and she was talking about how when governments create insecurity, they do it on purpose because insecurity encourages people to vote for authoritarian leaders because they become more fearful, right? They become more fearful and they want an authoritarian to control things because they feel out of control, right? So it's very much aligned with what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true. And I think, again, wherever you sit on your own opinions and choices in life, we are seeing en masse choices, similar to what this lady was saying, that sometimes you wonder, why are they choosing that? You know, I recently spent a couple of years living in Sri Lanka, and I do a lot of business in Sri Lanka, which is a small island off India, for anyone that doesn't know. I mean, not that small, about 25 million people, but it's smallish compared to its big sister in India. And they recently had a political and economic collapse last year. In fact, when I was living there, and it was a disaster for the island. We ran out of power, we ran out of fuel. There was a food shortage. Some days we didn't have electricity for 14 hours a day. I mean, the country collapsed entirely. Recently, the International Monetary Fund has helped them bail out of that, and they're hopefully on their way to recovery. But as part of that process, the people uprose and they overthrew the government, right? Which is an amazing for a relatively peaceful Buddhist country, right? And they did it. They succeeded. They went to the streets and they said to the government in power at the time, no more. Like, this is ridiculous. We have no power. We have no fuel. You know, our children don't have enough food. But 1 year later, it's amazing how quickly people forget, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going into new elections. Sri Lanka's going into new elections in a year's time. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether the people, and again, predominantly under the poverty line, right? So these are not highly educated people. They're rural people. They're relatively poor people. But there is a lot of discussion how those same people are going to go and vote them back in. The time will tell. But you're absolutely right. When people are scared, When people are fearful and uncomfortable, all kinds of things happen that is not necessarily the rational, thinking. And that really is impacting decisions all over the world.
So what is the consequence of an increased lack of empathy? First of all, before actually I ask you that question, could you define empathy so the listener understands what it actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I define empathy as perspective taking. That's it. Because the reason I keep it so simple, I work a lot with the corporate world, is because you can read for hours about empathy, right? And similar to compassion, many forms of it, many ways to express it and understand it. But given our desperate need for it, I think it's our requirement to simplify it so that people can just understand fundamentally what we're talking about. Fundamentally, empathy is about being able to take the perspective of somebody else, right? So you often hear people talk about standing in the shoes of another, right? Understanding, why is someone behaving like that? Why are they speaking like that? Why are they not performing in their job anymore? Why has my neighbor stopped coming out in the mornings? It's about understanding other people. So fundamentally, we're talking about listening, because the backbone of empathy is understanding. And how are you ever going to understand if you don't ask questions, right? If you don't listen? So empathy is about perspective taking and being able to understand why other people are where they are, saying what they're saying, doing what they're doing, being able to use your imagination to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else.
That's a great definition, very helpful. So now I'll ask you the question I started asking you, which is what happens when we are lacking in empathy?
So fundamentally, again, if we keep it super simple, when empathy goes down, all of the isms go up. And what I mean by that, racism, ageism, sexism, ableism, nationalism, any ism, right? When there is low empathy between us, there are gaps between us, there is a lack of understanding. When there's a lack of understanding, as we were just touching on, fear increases. And when we're scared, we are not, emotionally connected, we judge on all kinds of ways. So I often say to people that we talk about being more inclusive than ever before, but in my experience, we're more disconnected than ever before, right? So the racism, the aggression, the fear of the unknown, because of all the things we touched on, is increasing all the time. So when there's low empathy, there's high distance between people. And fundamentally what that creates, other than all of the isms I just spoke about, is both physiological and psychological issues for people. So we see a mental health crisis around the world, 400 million people with depression. It is now the highest burden to our healthcare system worldwide. And the Surgeon General in the US in July told us that the connection between mental health and loneliness was the largest it's ever been, with loneliness being as dangerous as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. So there's a huge psychological burden, but there's also a physiological impact, because as I touched on earlier, as human beings, we are meant to be together. We are not meant to be alone. When we are isolated, when we are prejudiced against or stereotyped, when we are separated out from people with low understanding, with low empathy, immunity goes down, heart disease goes up, all kinds of physiological responses to that. So in short, Marcia, it's dangerous. It's just not good for us at all.
It's not good for us, and it's not good for our community, and it's not good for our world.
Absolutely.
And I look at people sometimes when they do these antisocial behaviors, right? Like littering, or there's this little tree that's trying to grow on my street. And every time I go for my walks, I pass it by. And the kids in the neighborhood keep breaking off branches. It's just this little tree. It's just trying to survive. And I don't understand what it is in these kids that make them want to destroy this little tree that's just struggling to live. You would think that they would have empathy and they'd want to support the little tree, especially since they're kids. They'd want to support this little small tree, but they keep trying to kill it. And I just feel like when people lack empathy, they don't even have any appreciation for the harm that they're doing. They just do harm because maybe it's self-stimulating or self-soothing or distracting, but they don't have any kind of recognition. It's like this void.
Yeah, and I wonder, Marcia, if you ask those kids why, what you would hear, I think for sure there's a disconnect, between them and the natural world. And I said earlier, we can change it and it is within our control. And I don't know how old these children are, but my daughter's 6. Of course, we're on a different side of the world. So culturally, there's obviously loads of differences. But what I see in her and her little friends is a massive shift in that connection to the world around them. So when you ask my little girl about littering, she cannot understand it. I mean, it's like you're talking to her in a foreign language. You can see it on her face. She's like, but why would you do that? You say, well, maybe some people are lazy, or honestly, she's growing up in a world where they cannot possibly comprehend that, and sometimes we'll see litter and she goes, and I'm like, what's wrong? She's like, look, and there's like a Coke can on the floor or something. So I really have hope that this future generation are coming through the system with a renewed sense of this, of connectivity, of the environment, of society. But as you said, of course, it has to start with the education system. It has to start with the home. And of course, you're seeing it on your very street. So maybe you should put like a little box around the tree marsh and a little sign and say, I'm trying to grow. Can you help me? And I wonder what would happen. You should do it. You should do a social experiment, because I wonder if you actually drew their attention to it, whether that would suddenly shift. Like if you could humanize the tree.
I'm trying to grow just like you.
I'm trying to grow just like you. Can you help me? What I need is sunlight, earth and whatever they need in the middle of winter.
And not to be harmed. Yeah.
What would happen?
Yeah, I'm going to try that. I'm going to try that. I'll see, because I've actually talked to the kids at times when I've seen them doing this, and they scoff. They scorn me.
How old are they?
They're like preteens, 12. And they scoff at me and they think I'm the crazy lady walking down the street going for her walks. I'm the crazy lady who likes birds and animals and trees. They think I'm crazy because to them, birds and animals and trees is irrelevant.
It's such a shame, isn't it? I don't see that. It breaks my heart as well. I mean, and why it breaks my heart beyond the obvious is that we need this generation to change the world we've created. And that disconnection is just is carrying on this lack of compassion, this lack of empathy, this lack of understanding for our world. And I think, I often talk about the difference between compassion and empathy, because they are very different. So the way I explain that is that empathy is a skill set fundamentally, right? It's built into your prefrontal cortex. We are all born, the majority of us, with empathy as a skill set in our brain, right? It's a pro-social skill set. Where, of course, in my opinion, and please tell me what you think, compassion is an action. Compassion is a response. It's a choice, And I wonder, with your example with the tree, how much is a lack of empathy and how much is a lack of compassion, and where the point between them would meet? Like, how much do they not understand the need for those trees to survive, and how hard it's trying to survive, and how much of that is a lack of compassion and, just like you said, not caring about anyone other than myself, which is that very individualistic reality that we're seeing out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. To me, compassion is when you see something or someone and you feel moved to act and you have no choice. It's like when your daughter feels like she has to pick up that Coke can, right? Because she has compassion for the planet, right? So to me, my experience of compassion is that it's a choice, but I don't have a choice because I'm compelled to act. I have to do something. I cannot do nothing because I see something and I just have to respond. So that to me is compassion, when you don't even want to. It's like when you said, I didn't, plan on writing a book, but I had to do it, right? I was moved to do it. It's like when you just can't not do it. That to me is true compassion, because that response just is there.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
Mm.
Because people often ask me this question about empathy, but I'm really interested to hear what you say from a compassion point of view. Can you run out of it? Like, can you run out of it or be overloaded by it? If you are compassionate, 24 hours a day, what happens?
Yeah, you're talking about compassion fatigue. And I think it's not that you run out of compassion. I think that what happens is that other things get in the way of your natural ability to experience and express your compassion. When we're talking about compassion fatigue, I think it's a misnomer. I think what it is it's compassion behind obstacles, right? It's compassion facing obstacles, because we need to take care of ourselves. Like when I talk about ruthless compassion, my definition is compassion with backbone, compassion with self-care, compassion with boundaries, compassion with a sense of, our own value, our own worth. So you don't just give and deplete yourself. You fill yourself so that you can overflow outward onto others. And so it's a win-win, right? That
Okay.
to me is ruthless compassion. So the ruthless is just, I'm not just going to give until I'm completely depleted and dead. That's to
Yeah.
me is not the best, way of being compassionate, because then you're dead and you can't help anymore. So ruthless compassion is a better model because you stay alive, you can help yourself and others, right? So
Okay.
to me, what happens with people is either by their own choice because they're people pleasers and they just can't stop, or because they feel so deeply that they just, feel compelled and they don't recognize the importance of balance and self-care, or because they're put in a circumstance. And I think most of the time it's because our society puts the good people, the kind people, the compassionate people in situations and exploits them. The medical people, the workers. I see so many people who work and are put in situations in their workplace where they're taken advantage of because they're, dedicated, devoted, hardworking, and, kind. And so these people, they lose their compassion because there are obstacles, which is that they're exhausted, they're depleted. And when you're exhausted and depleted, you run out of juice, you run out of energy, life energy, and you can't give. So I don't think it's a lack of compassion. I think it's, when you deplete the engine, there's nothing left.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah. As I said, it's a question I get asked all the time with empathy. And what we know about empathy is that actually burnout decreases when empathy increases. So particularly in the medical field, you were talking about doctors just then. That's what the data shows, that the more empathy they have for their patients, the less quickly or likely they are to burn out. Because I like how you sort of say that it's like a life force, almost like a life energy, right, that we have. But as you said, you have to, I guess, find that balance.
Yeah, I think it's also circular because if you are overexhausted, it's easy to lose empathy
Mm.
because you're only focusing on your own survival. Like if you have a little self-preservation piece inside of you, then you're like, uh-oh, I have to turn it all off and just focus on, feeding my own self because I'm about to keel over, right? And so then it's hard to be empathetic or compassionate if your only focus
Mm.
is how can I survive this ordeal?
Mm.
So I think it's circular. I think, being exhausted and depleted makes you less empathetic, and then being less empathetic, makes you more burnt out. So, right?
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you.
And now let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. Since I was a kid, I've loved watching movies. As a psychiatrist, I'm blown away by how film touches us at our core, deepens our self-knowledge, and can improve the human condition. I wanted to let listeners know that I've started a new podcast called Real Mental with Dr. Marcia Sirota. I'm going to be talking with film and TV experts to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health on the big and small screen. Some recent films covered are Turning Red, Everything Everywhere All at Once, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and Asteroid City. Please subscribe to Real Mental on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. So I'm going to ask you another question. So what have you learned? Obviously, you've done all this studying and all this research, but what have you learned that surprised you in the field of it?
What have I learned that surprised me? That's such a good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that one before.
Oh, good.
What have I learned that has surprised me? I think I'm surprised at how little people understand what this is and how deep the deficit is. This morning, Marsha, I also was walking, and I walked home from my daughter's school, and there was a part of the road where we had to walk over, there's a flyover, like a bridge to cross the road. And there was a homeless person on that bridge. As you said earlier, I live in Malaysia, so it's not my own country, it's an Islamic country. And I'm always very sensitive to, local customs and all those types of things. As I came up the stairs, I saw quite a few women, and Malaysians are lovely people, lovely, kind, warm people. But walking past, I could see there was a homeless person at the top of the stairs, which of course is, I guess, normal all around the world, we do. But when I got to the top, I don't know if it was a girl or a boy, but she or he was very young, like a teenager. like maybe 13 or something. And I feel awful that I did nothing. And I've already told myself that tomorrow I'm going to walk on the same bridge and see if that child is there. I have no idea if she speaks English, but it was really shocking to me that everybody else was just walking past her. Now, that's not to say that I can't help. I can, but also I'm a foreigner. I don't speak their language. This isn't my home. I have no idea where I would take her. You know, I've only been here a few months. Whether that, I don't even know if there is a social care system. I have no idea of the dynamics of how that works here. But the ladies that live here do. And they're just walking past this child. And there's not many homeless people here. So this is not a common sight. So for the rest of my walk home, that's what I was trying to work out. Right? And I think that surprises me often, is how much we ignore what's going on around us. How much people are able, you touched on it earlier about sort of people exploiting others, how easy it is for us to bury our heads and carry on, you know. And, you know, we're coming up to Christmas. And of course, I don't think anybody shouldn't celebrate Christmas. I understand it's a very important time of year. But at the same time, there's such atrocities going on around the world. How do we balance that? You know, and how is it that people can go from, you know, donating on the one hand and then, you know, living in deep consumerism on the other, right? So I think I find that quite hard. I think I do find it quite surprising. I guess maybe I'm quite a soft person, but I find the sort of harshness that people will talk to others in the workplace very surprising all the time, you know. So I work with a lot of organizations and staff tell me what happens, right? And that I find very surprising. So I think I find humans surprising, to be honest. I believe in the best in everyone, you know. And as I said earlier, I believe we can fix this. I spend every day, like you do, right, working towards creating positive change and building the conversation and creating education. And we're launching an academy and all of this stuff, right? I believe in a better future. But I am surprised at how awful people can be to each other. You know, I think you can get in your channel and miss it for a bit, and then something happens, like a whole load of women walking past a homeless teenager. Again, I want to really be clear, this is very rare here. There are not homeless people everywhere, right? It's not San Francisco. I can imagine when I went to San Francisco, there was people everywhere. And they just ignore them.
But I'm so glad that you said that, you know, you're surprised at how awful people can be to each other, because I think if we aren't living in the truth of what, you know, of the dark part of what we're capable of, then it's all about, you know, this sort of la la la, everyone's wonderful, everything's great, it's all going to be good, you know, best of all possible worlds. And to me, that's not constructive, because how can we build anything positive on a fantasy, right? So when we face the truth, that's ruthless compassion. Also, it's like facing the truth of what's really there, you know, without, you know, self-judgment, without being abusive, but just saying, okay, this is how it is. Then we have a place that's authentic to move from, to embark from, right? So it's good to be surprised at how awful people can be, I think, because then we can see, okay, so how can we get them to change? Right? If we know what we're capable of, both the bad and the good, then we're in reality.
Yeah, I find that quite soothing, Marsha, to hear you say that, because certainly in the last 2 months, and it's quite unusual for me, perhaps because I generally disconnect from the news, you know, to protect myself from being in it every day. And perhaps in the last 2 months, I've been more connected to the news. But I find that very soothing, what you said, because you're right. You would then at least find a platform to take the hurt and turn it into growth wherever you can, however you can, on a daily basis, right? Like one person at a time. Because you're right, it's very overwhelming. People do awful things to each other. And as we touched on earlier, every time you turn on Instagram or the news, whatever you're watching, you are bombarded. Where's the good news, right? Where are the good people?
Yeah. And I think, you know, look, these platforms make money portraying all the negative, because that's where they get the hits, right? That's where they get their bang for the buck. So obviously there's a distortion with social media, and the news is following in suit, because they're realizing that sensationalism and negativity gets more eyeballs. But I don't think that's everything, because there's positive, but those stories don't necessarily get precedence on, you know, many of the platforms. But I think that, to me, my go-to always, when, you know, tragedy strikes, when bad things are happening in my own life, is to turn to positive things. to like make lemonade out of the lemons, right? That's my, it sounds like a cliche, but it's not to deny that there are lemons. It's not to deny how sour they are. It's to go, wow, sour. Let's see what I can do about this, right? And it's always about transformative change, right? It's always about taking that awfulness and really acknowledging, accepting, facing, grieving, mourning, feeling all the feelings, and then saying, okay, how can we take this and use it as fuel? Like my motto for this podcast is people who've turned their emotional shit into fertilizer, and it's fertilizer for growth and change, right? So that's really my motto, and it's the motto of the podcast. But I think that when we can see all that negativity, then we have the motivation and the wherewithal to do something about it. And obviously you're doing that. So now I'm going to ask you about what can be done, right? What can be done to take all that negativity in the world, all that lack of empathy, and turn it into something more positive, more life affirming, more constructive for the world, for each other.
Yeah. I mean, I think I touched on it earlier a little bit, but I believe, and I see every day, and we're doing it right now actually, that listening to each other can fundamentally shift what's going on out there. So much violence and aggression, or it could not be that end of the spectrum. It could just be segregation or, anti-inclusive behavior in the workplace is happening because we don't understand each other, right? Because we live on assumptions, right? We make assumptions that people are doing X because of Y. And often, senior people come to me in the workplace and they say, listen, we've got this problem, our people are resigning, or they're unhappy, or we have, too much demotivation in the workplace. Mimi, what do we do about it? And I say, well, have you asked the people why? And they're like, oh, no, we haven't done that. I'm like, well, maybe you should start there, right? So I do believe that, at least in the work I'm doing, listening is a really good start. Of course, there are 1 million ways to donate money and time and growth and education. And there's, an endless list of what the world needs. But for me, in the work that I'm doing with my team, this is where we're starting, teaching people to listen to each other. Are you hearing this person? What is beneath or, surrounding the argument or the disconnect or the disengagement? Often I say to my clients, acknowledgement is so much more powerful than action. People don't need you to solve all the problems, but they do need you to acknowledge, what they're going through or how they see it, or, where their struggle or barrier is. So I see this all the time. I see it in the teams that I train. I do lots of workshops and keynotes and that type of thing. I hear it in the feedback. But I also have a podcast. And in that podcast, we have it's an anonymous, camera off storytelling podcast. So people come onto the show and they share their stories, and they do it anonymously for 2 reasons. One, to protect from unconscious bias and judgment, right? They might not want their wife, husband, teacher, boss hearing what they're saying. But the second is really to ensure that people can hear them without that bias, right? Because the minute you hear a name, particularly in this side of the world, names come with a lot of baggage, religion, where you're from, what all kinds of things. So if I give you an example, Marcia, if you hear a domestic violence story with a very sort of quintessentially American name, sort of a very traditional American name, versus a woman's name, which is very clearly from the Islamic faith or the Middle East, people come into that story with a whole load of assumptions about who that woman is and who she's married to, and all of this stuff. And I always say to people that they shouldn't be ashamed of unconscious bias. It is just who we are. We carry biases. We can't stop it, right? You might think that walking's a good thing. I might think it's not. Those are biases. We live with them. But we can be conscious about overcoming them. And the reason I'm saying this is that what I know is that when I listen to those stories, I don't know these people. I'm never going to meet them. I speak to women in, deepest Africa, people in war zones, people all over the world. I'm never going to meet them. I often never see their face. But when we get to the end of the show and I turn the record off and I say, how was that for you? Nearly like 90% of the time, they say to me, oh, Mimi, I feel like a weight has been lifted, right? I feel so good for telling that story. So the reason I'm sharing this is not to talk about my podcast, but is to talk about the power of listening. All I do is turn up and listen to them. I can't help them. I can't take the army out their villages. I can't rebuild their schools, right? I just hear them for 1 hour, 45 minutes. And it shifts, at least for a short time, it shifts how they feel and their perspective and the confidence that they go away with. So Listening changes humans, and we're just not doing it enough. So to answer that question, I think that we should be investing far more time in how we listen, who we listen to, the platforms that enable us to listen. There are, as we said earlier, there's so many lonely people in the world, and that comes with, well, everything, but including shorter lifespans. So listening can literally make people live longer.
That's amazing. So if listening is so important, what gets in the way of it?
Lots of things get in the way. I mean, particularly in workplaces, bias gets in the way, as I just said. Assumption gets in the way. Fear gets in the way. So if you are uncomfortable listening to someone, you find it hard to listen to them. Ego gets in the way. Because you want to share what you think, or you think that your opinion or answer or solution, particularly in the workplace, is better than the one they're sharing. The need to be right, the need to show up, especially again in the workplace. And then a whole lot of physiological things can also get in the way. You're tired, you're stressed, you're hungry. So there's many things. And it's funny you asked me that, because I ask that in my workshops, and I get the room to answer the question before I put a slide up with some of these answers on them. And people know, if you ask them, think about what gets in the way of you listening, they can list them all. It's not that they don't know what gets in the way. They're just on autopilot, right? So I always say that empathy has two great enemies. One is low time, and the other is high stress. And if I asked your listeners today in your virtual worlds to put your hand up, if you have low time and high stress, I would guess, Marsha, that nearly everybody listening is going to be, right? Because we all have low time and high stress. And, that's very much based on neuroscience. When we are under stress and pressure and panic and fear and all of these things that we're living in our daily life, the brain is a very amazing thing. But the one thing that it can't do is it can't distinguish between types of fear from an evolutionary point of view. So whether you really are, at fear for your life, right? Or you're just extremely stressed and running against the clock and picking up the kids and getting to work and answering the next call and all of that stuff, the brain responds in the same way to that stress. And what it does is it releases adrenaline, cortisol into the body, and it moves the oxygen and the blood flow away from the thinking parts of your brain to the physical areas, such as your lungs, your legs, your limbs, to be able to escape, to be able to overcome the fear that it is perceiving that you are seeing, right? So from an evolutionary point of view, that would probably be, being confronted with a saber-toothed tiger, right, in the jungle, back in the caveman era. So when we live in that state of stress, and the stress is a good thing, right? Anxiety is a good thing. It exists to protect you, because if there's a tiger coming, your body needs to respond in a way that tells you to run, okay? But of course, that was a fleeting moment. You see the tiger, you run away, and hopefully you're safe, right? Or dead, but hopefully you're safe. We're not meant to live under these hormones. We're not meant to live with cortisol and adrenaline in our body for hours and days and weeks and months on end. So when we're living in that state, it is actually impossible, like physiologically impossible, to use the parts of your brain to listen, to empathize, to understand, because your body is doing the opposite. Your body is pushing out the oxygen from that part of your brain. So really, that's where, being able to get in control of these things, to find time. People often say to me, but I don't have time to listen at work, Mimi, right? And I say, well, you have to find time. But the great thing about listening in the workplace is that the more you listen, the more time you create. And I really believe this, because the better your relationships get. So to look at the workplace, every piece of data improves when listening improves, when empathy goes up. Productivity, motivation, output, creative thinking, innovation, you name it, Marsha, and it goes up. You are creating time. You are creating results. So I talk about balancing humanism with capitalism, because they can't be separate. The more you invest in your people, the better your business will do. Same in life. So those are the things that get in the way. And as I said, really consciousness around that practice. In fact, the last 3 words in my book are: practice creates permanence, because the more you do it, the more you create off the back of it.
No, absolutely. And when you were talking about how time pressure and stress makes it hard to listen, but like you said, listening actually takes away stress, because as soon as you feel connected to people, you release oxytocin, you release endorphins, you start to feel good. So one quick stress reliever is to actually go and listen to somebody, because you will feel better right away and your stress will go down. So it's this vicious circle, right? It's this paradox because the thing that we could do that would make us de-stress is the thing that we're not doing because we feel stressed.
Because we're stressed. Yeah, I had that experience on the way home. I just took a sip now of iced tea, and it's iced tea that I bought at a tiny, tiny little, we call it a cade, like a little informal coffee shop on the way home, run by two young women, like almost like a shed, right? Like on the way home from my daughter's school. And I was very stressed this morning going to school and all of these things. And I stopped to buy the tea, and I spoke to the two ladies, they're young women, about their little business. They've been there 4 months and how are they doing? And they told me about the food they're cooking. And you're absolutely right, because by the time I bought the tea, I felt it had gone. I was smiling again. I was like, everything's great in the world. Just by that little moment of listening to other people I've never met before talk to me about their business, right? And what they're doing, and the noodles, because we eat a lot of noodles in Malaysia, the noodles that they've made for breakfast, So you're absolutely right. That moment of human connection totally changes how you feel.
And so I think it's kind of like a double thing we need to do. We need to not only recognize that listening is important, but we also have to recognize that, we're so stressed, we're so unhappy, there is so much negativity, there's so much terrible stuff, but there's a very simple solution, which is to try to connect to each other, because as soon as we start connecting, everything gets better. It's like we feel better doing the listening, the person on the receiving end feels better being listened to, and then they might reciprocate, so then we're getting listened to, and it builds, right? So I think we've lost sight of how important, like you said, just that human connection is, that human moment. And it doesn't have to be a close friend, it doesn't have to be a relationship that goes on. It could be just a momentary interaction that's nice.
Yeah.
And it does a lot for us. It immediately flushes all that cortisol out of our system.
Gone.
Yeah, it's remarkable if we could see that.
Yeah, and that's why I think often, I travel the world for my work, so I fly every week, more or less. And I'm always struck by, how much the world has so much sympathy, for very good reason often, for people that have less. And, last week I was in India, in Jaipur, which is in northern India, and I was driving past some communities that are in deep poverty, incredible poverty that, you can't imagine most of the time. And yet how happy the people are, how happy they are. I mean, I'm not saying they're happy with the whole of life, right? I'm sure if I sat and had tea with them, they could tell me a million things they're unhappy about. But just the collective happiness of that community. When you drive through the community and the children and the mums, everybody's smiling. Everybody's working with each other. Everybody buys their food from the person who buys the vegetable. There is a collective community. And I'm absolutely sure there's a lot that they wish for. And of course, the basics, medical care and all these things. But as a fundamental energy, those communities that are so deeply connected, they live together, they build together, they support each other, they help each other when they're sick, they are happier. And again, this is not based on data. I don't have the data. I'm just telling you my experience. The collective reward of being connected to other people when you live in a close community is stronger than the materialism that we think we need to connect to others, which I just think is amazing.
So I figured something out several years ago, and I wish people would listen to me, because I keep jumping on my soapbox and ranting about it, but I'll share it with you, which is that when we find a false solution to our problem, like materialism, so we're unhappy, we're lonely, we feel empty, we feel like our life is lacking in meaning, purpose, and connection. And we find a false solution. It could be addiction, it could be materialism. Let's say it's money, it's materialism, money and power. That's a big one these days, right? And fame. Ooh, gonna have fame. Okay. And then it fails to satisfy. We have this funny thing in our brain that says, okay, it has failed because I'm not doing it enough. So I just need to do it more. So more of the wrong solution will, in our mind, eventually become the correct solution. So we do it more and it fails. And then we go, well, obviously I just haven't done it more. And we just keep pursuing that thing, thinking that if we finally get to do it enough, it will finally eventually be successful. And that's why these people who are billionaires are still chasing money. That's why the power mongers are still chasing power. That's why the addicts are still chasing their fix. It's because they are compelled to pursue the false solution, falsely believing that more of the wrong thing will eventually become the right
Correct.
thing.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. I think we live in a more society. And unfortunately, when you look at so many, especially if we look at the celebrity world, we look at so many young celebrities that end up committing suicide or in rehab or, whatever's going on for them. And it's a pattern that we see over and over and over again. And yet our young people still want to be them. And you think, what? I know I probably was one of them when I was young, but what are they seeing in these people? Like, as you said, this fame, money, power thing that unfortunately our societies strive for, even though, as you just mentioned, they're not actually filling any of the needs that these people want. But I hope you do get on your soapbox, and I'm listening. I'm definitely. But please keep saying it, because I think you're absolutely right, and hopefully the world is heading for a change. There is, I think, now at least more awareness and openness to these discussions. The fact that you were inviting me on a podcast about compassion, right? That you get up every week and you're creating a podcast about compassion. I do the same about empathy, and there are hundreds, probably thousands of other people doing similar things. We didn't all exist before, right? Not only are we doing it, we're investing our time and our money, but we have audiences that are investing their time and energy to listen and to hear and to grow. So I think there is an awareness, and hopefully it just takes time, right, to create some collective groundswell to fill in those gaps. And I do think that the education system has to be where this starts, because those children on your street that are putting down the tree, they need a different education, right? They need to understand how their actions are going to impact others and their future, but also the present, right? So hopefully, Marsha, the change is upon us.
Well, I think when we're doing this work, we have to have hope, right? We have to keep, doing the work and hoping, that there will be results at some point.
Yeah. So here we go. Here's to positivity, more empathy, and more compassion.
For sure, for sure. Well, I'm going to wind up because I know you have your day to get onto, and I have getting ready for bed to get onto. So I'm going to ask you my final 3 questions. So the first question is, you said there's a new project that you're working on that you're about to launch. I'd love you to share that with our listeners.
Thank you for asking. So yeah, we're launching my business. My platform is called Empathy Everywhere, and they can find that at www.empathyeverywhere.co. And Empathy Everywhere is a platform that is about to launch our own academy. So that will be an online academy that does training and teaching in empathy, in connection, in community, in listening and understanding. And there's 2 parts of that. There's the learning part of that, and there is also a community that we're building within that called Open Room. And Open Room is a concept that it is an open room. Anyone can come. Everybody is welcome. There's no payment. I'm not another one of those influencers that wants you to pay $9.99 to join, right? None of that. It is a community created for people that are interested in these discussions. It lives on WhatsApp and Instagram broadcast channels. We share tips and info and inspiration. We have a movie club. We have conversation. We have open rooms online where people can come, and we have discussions. We do webinars. We do all kinds of stuff, and it's all free, right? It's all there just to create more understanding, more listening, more empathy, and to overcome loneliness. So that's what we're launching. The community launched, Open Room launched a couple of months ago, and the academy is coming in January. But yeah, I'm very excited. I'm very excited to finally have spaces and products within this platform. This platform has always been about creating empathy, but now I feel that we've evolved to such a point where we actually have things that can help us do that. So yeah, I hope you can come and see it.
That sounds wonderful. Yeah, it sounds really, really exciting. And if people want to find you, where can they find you? Your work, your book, etc.
Yeah. So my book is called Softening the Edge, and it's on Amazon. My name is Mimi Nicklin, and I'm at Mimi Nicklin on every social platform. And as I said, my website is www.empathyeverywhere.co.
Sounds good. And for the final question, which
I'm
is
ready.
my favorite question, which is your call to action. So I know you've made lots of suggestions through the podcast, but after our lovely, lovely discussion today, what would you like to invite the listeners to try moving forward?
So I would like less to invite them to try, but more to invite them to consider that we are all more alike than we are different. And I think that I spend every day saying that the more the world talks about empathy, the more empathy the world will have. And I would love for just any of your listeners to take away that sentiment and just to think about it. Think about the fact that we're all more alike than we are different, and look for those connections in life. Who can you listen to today? It might be the barrister or the bus driver, or of course it might be your kids or your boss. But just to take away that awareness that listening can change the world and close the gap. So I would love to think that just one of us does it a little bit more tomorrow because they heard our show.
I think they will.
I hope so.
Well, thank you so much, Mimi Nicklin, for coming on the Ruthless Compassion podcast. We definitely, rose to the occasion, figuring out our time differences across the world. But it was really great that we did, because I really enjoyed talking with you today.
Oh, me too, Marsha. Thank you so much for having me. It's honestly an honor, and for working across the time zones. And I hope now that we can become friends, global friends, in this mission that we both share. So thank you very much for having me.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thank you for listening. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll learn about upcoming online events as well. Also, we love getting referrals from our listeners about future podcast guests. So please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com.